From Studio 4 in the world headquarters of RT America in our nation's capital, this is the News with Rick Sanchez.
And good evening. Pancreatic cancer. Sadly, those words are as close to a death sentence as it gets. But tonight, there may be, for the first time ever, a breakthrough in the treatment of this insidious disease. And we're going to have that for you. That story is coming up in just a little bit. But we're going to begin with what our government is doing to enforce its will on other countries. However, here's the real interesting takeaway here. Other countries are now pushing back. That's right. Belgium, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden. They've just joined an effort, and this is unprecedented, to create a trade exchange to bypass the United States. Mind you, these are countries who in the past have always been in lockstep with the United States. So really, we can't help but ask on a day like this, what gives, right? Michelle Greenstein, she's going to be joining us to break this down for us, and she's going to be here with that in just a little bit. But wait, there's more. Tonight, Reuters has come out with a blockbuster of a report suggesting that the Trump administration is considering a total U.S. ban on Huawei. The Trump administration would essentially be telling the second largest seller of mobile phones in the entire world, you can't do business here. You can't do business in the United States. In fact, you can't even be a part of our banking system or use our banking system. It's a very anti-market, almost socialist move from an administration that often brags about standing for just the opposite. And while still not confirmed, Reuters is reporting that the attack on Huawei, a private Chinese company, by the way, is not coming from the Treasury Department, where one would expect something like this would be founded, right? No. It's coming from the National Security Council. The National Security Council. What is the NSC's formal beef with Huawei? This gets us back to our beginning here, right? Presumably that Huawei has or plans to do business in one form or another with Iran. So the question is the United States overreaching? And what might the global blowback be in a case like this? This is where we begin tonight here on the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe it's time to do news again. The list. The list of the questions we think you'll be asking tomorrow. Just how much are U.S. allies willing to push back against our economic policies? Mr. Trump goes to London to talk NATO, but is the alliance somehow coming undone? And promising news. Is there finally a treatment for pancreatic cancer? But we begin with blowback, as aforementioned, while the U.S. tries to muscle countries and companies all over the world, including Huawei, into not doing business with Iran. The world seems to be pushing back. Normally, we would hear that our usual adversaries and critics and rivals, China, Russia, Iran itself, and others would be coming up with ways to get around U.S. sanctions. But the pushback is not coming from adversaries and critics or rivals. It's coming from our longtime allies, members of the European Union, who have come up with something that's called INSTEX. Stands for the Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges. Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges, INSTEX. In other words, they think countries ought to be able to trade with each other. Novel idea. Joining us now, News with Rick Sanchez special correspondent Michelle Greenstein. I bet we could almost rename this INSTEX thing the Iran workaround plan, right?
It's definitely been called stuff along those lines. This facilitates trade between Iran and EU country without sending any money across borders. So like you kind of just alluded to, it's designed to bypass U.S. sanctions. So it's essentially a barter arrangement, and it's not yet operative, but it makes this channel through which transactions can be enabled in the absence of SWIFT, which is the current dominant international payment system. Now, as some back background. It was established in January and created as a reaction to the U.S. unilaterally withdrawing from the JCPOA. This is a withdrawal that not only reinstated sanctions on Iran, but also created new ones. So Iran, of course, threatened to pull out as well. So these EU signatories said, hey, no, we promise that we will find a way to keep doing business with Iran. And Instex is part of that effort to get Iran to remain in the JCPOA. Now, France, Germany, and the UK are to be managing this so-called clearinghouse, and it's also been made available to all other EU member states. Belgium, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden have now signed on as of this week. And in a joint statement, they called this move a demonstration that Europeans are efforting to facilitate legitimate trade between Europe and Iran. Now, in terms of an international reaction, we had the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calling this act European countries enabling a fanatic terrorist state. And we also had U.S. Vice President Mike Pence later this year saying that it's time for Europe to stop undermining sanctions against, quote, murderous revolutionary machines. But I think what's really important to note here, Rick, is that Instex is not actually as revolutionary as it may sound. For one thing, it's yet to enable any transactions, even though it's been operational since June. And also, Instex is only regarding what the Trump administration has not sanctioned. So it fails to cover exports of Iranian oil, gas, and petrochemicals. And it also, and this is really significant, does not cover Iranian imports of food or medicine. So we have to remember that sanctions on Iran really hurt ordinary people by and large, right? It's caused prices of imported medicines to soar. In fact, this August, 5 doctors from both Iran and the U.S. wrote this really great editorial in The Lancet showing that sanctions damaged Iran's universal healthcare system. And they say that Iran's now at a high risk of moving towards a severe situation for provision of health services with substantive impacts on mortality and morbidity. So the universal healthcare system has been sharply hit by these sanctions, mainly because it's now impossible to import these very key materials. And even Human Rights Watch, which has been criticized in the past for supporting a U.S. imperialist agenda, said that these U.S. sanctions, quote, pose a serious threat to Iranians' right to health and access to essential medicines. So many are calling Instex kind of more smoke and mirrors than an actual change in policy.
So yeah, that's interesting. I was going to follow up by asking you just that. If it really doesn't help Iran in terms of being able to sell its oil or being able to feed its people, then who's it helping?
I mean, there's definitely a political upside here. It definitely gives the appearance that these EU countries want to restore, quote unquote, normal trade relations with Iran. But they're, of course, still complicit with the Trump administration's economic warfare. In fact, Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif said, quote, for the past 5 months, Europe has been trying to give us credit in return for the sale of Iranian crude oil to make the country stay in the JCPOA. But it has not been able to do even this little job because it is not even allowed by its master.
So one does wonder, because, you know, we have to also mention the fact that there's news out there that there are still protests, there is still some turmoil inside Iran. How much of that is manifested by these sanctions and this pressure that's being put on the Iranian economy?
Right. I think this goes back to the essential point, which is that sanctions do hurt ordinary people. This, of course, paves the way for unrest. And this current protest movement that we're seeing now in Iran was sparked by this gas hike, right? And according to U.S. law, this is also important. The president is actually authorized to provide financial and political assistance to Iranians so long as they are committed to being against the government. So it's possible that the U.S.'s hands may not be so clean. But I think it's also, and this is my final point, I promise. It's important to note that although you could say that this is blowback, you could also say that the JCPOA and its subsequent withdrawal by the U.S. actually works right in with the agenda that many are saying the U.S. have, which is regime change in Iran. According to the Brookings Institution, which has been called the most prestigious think tank in the world by the New York Times, they said that this is how regime change in Iran would play out. They said, quote, for those who favor regime change or a military attack on Iran, the ideal scenario would be that the U.S. and the international community present a package of of positive inducements like the Iran deal. And any military operation against Iran would probably be very unpopular, but the best way to maximize support is to strike only when there's widespread conviction that the Iranians were given but then rejected a superb offer.
You know, you don't have to make that your final point. Stick around, because I want to bring in Surabh Gupta now. He's a policy specialist at the Institute for China-American Studies. How about the point that Michelle was just making? A lot of people would look at this and say, what the United States, and in this case, by proxy, Bibi Netanyahu, are essentially saying, right, is we don't like them, and you have to then not like them. And to prove to us you don't like them, you got to make sure you don't trade with them. I mean, it sounds rudimentary, but that's pretty much the argument. Am I wrong?
You're absolutely correct. It's the fading days, the dying days of the unipolar moment, and trying to milk it as much as possible, and trying to see that you coerce and force allies, partners, or anybody in the international community.
But how significant is it that, I think we mentioned this earlier, guys, that this is not Russia pushing back. This is not Iran pushing back. This is not China or Pakistan pushing back. This is the European Union pushing back against the United States of America. How significant is that?
I think it's very, very significant. The EU has always been an actor which has worked which has sometimes worked ostentatiously, but always in tow with the US. And for the first time, we are seeing the the EU actively questioning itself as to where the heck are we going with the US. Some European countries have followed the US in many of the US's wars, and it's not really turned out well for them.
Right.
I think it's been a
Iraq,
long time. Yes.
Tony Blair.
Libya.
Egg on his face. Continue.
Yep. And so they've finally come around to thinking that maybe we are not being led necessarily in the best place, in the best direction. And now with populism and Trump's trade protectionism, there's been a real divergence between the two countries.
But there's a difference here too, and I think we would be foolhardy to not mention that these countries who are essentially going against U.S. policy are bound by a treaty to do that, right?
Oh, absolutely, particularly in the Iran deal. And here's the real irony of it. First of all,